Welcome back to Dark Corner Studios. My name is Aidan Wolf, and today we're going to be talking about how to launch a podcast, all the way from it being just a kernel of thought in your head, all the way up to it being uploaded to the internet. So let's do this. This is Aidan Wolf. So I'm just going to level with you. This is the fourth time I've shot this video. Each time has had some sort of quirk with it. The first time I had a piece of hair hanging off my face. The second time everybody was home and that was a miserable thing. And then just minutes ago, I shot this video. I was getting ready to edit it, and lo and behold, I had a piece of food on my face. So excuse me for a second. I'm just going to make sure we're all good to go. How to start a podcast. Number one, what is your podcast about? This is the first thing you have to come up with. And yes, you really do need a direction for your podcast for people to really cling on to it. If you're going to have a podcast of people just sitting around and chatting, that's cool. Don't expect much traction from that. Have an idea of where you're going with your podcast and make sure it's something that you're passionate about it. That is really important when you first start out, because you're not going to have a lot of people listening to you, and you really need to have the passion to push you through that. Number two is format. A lot of people don't consider this to be the most important part of doing a podcast, but having a format laid out in front of you will let you plan your podcast and keep it on track. It could include an intro. Maybe it has some descriptions of what you're going to be talking about and when. Maybe you've got certain sections of your podcast where you kind of lean off course left or right. Whatever you have, you have your intro, you have any discussions, and you have your outro all laid out. That keeps you on track and keeps your podcast nice and tight. Number three, and probably one of the hardest things for me to do, and that is naming a podcast. This is one of those things that you want to make sure is unique enough that you stand out in a crowd, but also is pertaining to your podcast. This name is going to probably represent you for a long time, and it's not something that's easy to change without losing traction on your podcast. You're going to be dragging that name with you the whole time you're doing your podcast. So make sure it's a good one, and make sure that it has a level of uniqueness to it so it does stand out in the crowd. Next up, and I know you're all waiting for this one, you get to buy your gear. Now, you want to make sure that you future-proof yourself when buying gear, and that means if you're going to start out with a USB mic, make sure that microphone also has an XLR connector. That way, if you have to move from 1-2 hosts up to 3 or 4, you're going to be able to actually upgrade your whole kit without going out and buying new microphones. Perfect example of this would be the Q2U or the ATR 2100. Both great mics to start with, and they're going to future-proof you, so later on, you're not finding yourself dropping a whole lot more money when you end up having to expand the podcast. On top of this, they're also not brutally expensive microphones, so if you decide to pack it in, which is a possibility, you're not losing your shorts on the equipment. And by the way, if you want to see what some of the best microphones or interfaces are to start out a podcast, you can check them out in this or just one of these corners here. I'll put up the links so you can go watch those videos. Now we get to start recording the podcast. And this is actually a pretty tough bump for a lot of people to get over. It's because it's not natural for a lot of people to talk into a mic. It's also not natural to hear your voice in a recorded environment. And this is one of those things that really holds people back from actually starting the whole process. So just get it done. Sit down in front of your mic with your co-host or alone. Finish your first 3 episodes. This is the time to have less than perfect episodes because not a lot of people are listening at first. So this is your learning time. This is the time you can take to learn how to do all the things, including setting up each episode, including having interesting content that people want to listen to, all that fun stuff. So just record your episodes and get them up. And the next tip kind of leads from the last one. It's kind of integrated with that. And it's just learning how to do all of the podcast stuff. One of the biggest things you need to learn is how to edit a podcast. And this has one heck of a learning curve. The best advice at this point is to sit down and take a full afternoon, go through whatever editing DAW you've decided to go with, whether it's Audition, whether it's Audacity, Pro Tools, doesn't matter. Sit down with it for an afternoon and learn the basics of how to edit. You won't need much more than that, and what that will teach you in that first couple hours of learning is how to put a podcast out. You don't need any fantastic editing skills, and make sure throughout this whole process you don't stop learning. Yes, you will learn the basics at first. It will take you a long time, but as you go and as you learn more, it will become faster for you, and the whole process will seem a whole lot easier. I got to say, this next tip, I suck at this, but it is so integral to actually getting your podcast out. But it's the one that not a lot of people put a lot of thought into. It's your artwork. Now, if you're like me and you suck at doing any kind of graphic design or anything artsy in a visual medium, you may just want to source out to Fiverr. And this is the only time I will ever recommend using Fiverr, but for a couple bucks, you might be able to get somebody to do something up. That way you'll have something to represent your show accurately, and it will be something that people will see and will identify with your show. Now, you can change your artwork later on, but at first you want at least something that's clean and represents you well. We're almost there. Now it's time to find your host. Now, your host is where you're going to be uploading your audio. A lot of the popular ones are Libsyn, Blueberry. A lot of people still use SoundCloud for this, but whomever you use, I'm not going to recommend any, but you need to use a host to get an RSS feed. That RSS feed is basically a web address, so Apple and Google and Stitcher can all point to your podcast so people can download it. You're going to need that for the next step, which is actually uploading your podcast to Apple and Google. Now, to do that, it's relatively simple. For Apple, you just go on to the Apple iTunes Connect. From there, you log in with your Apple ID, and when you get into the podcast section of that, you'll see a little plus up in the left-hand part of the screen. You click on that, put in your RSS feed, and you've got a podcast that's going to be published in about 48 hours. Now, it might take a little less time, or it might take a little bit more. If there are any issues, they will email you, and all you got to do is fix those issues, and your podcast is published. For Google, it's pretty much the exact same thing. You find Google Play, I believe they still call it. You log into that, and you upload your RSS feed. It is literally that simple to have your podcast hit the world. Lastly, and this is probably one of the hardest parts for a lot of people, is promoting your podcast. You need to get your podcast out there, but you got to do it in a way where you're not spamming different communities. One of the best ways is to join a community that actually has the same interests as your podcast. So if you like to cook and that's what your podcast is about, find a community where they talk about cooking. And when I say communities, there's some great ones on Reddit. You can get them on Facebook. It's becoming involved with those communities, chatting, talking. But I cannot stress this enough. Don't spam those communities. Those are your listeners. You don't want to irritate them. Find a nice and easy way to release your podcast episode, even on a weekly basis. Maybe talk to the admins, tell them who you are, see if you can get some sort of interaction between your podcast and the group. Find a way that you can integrate into the group without just being a spammy guy that shows up every week and throws his episode and walks away. Lastly, the best tip I can give is join a podcast group as well. These are going to be people that are doing the exact same thing as you, and there's a lot of tips and tricks to help you along your way. But once again, don't spam the group. These are podcasters. They're just like you. They're not going to be lifelong members. All you're going to do is get yourself booted for self-promotion. And one last quick tip before I let you go, and that is contracts. Yes, you should be writing up contracts. There is a possibility that the podcast you start is going to make money. If it starts to make money, well, how much does each person make off that podcast? Normally, what you'll find is one person does all of the editing, does all of the kind of the groundwork to get the podcast uploaded, and then the other person just shows up, records a podcast, and goes home. Now, if you believe both people deserve 50% of your podcast, good on you. Write that in a contract. But you can find some pretty hurt feelings between friends when money gets involved. So just make sure that you cover yourself with a contract so nobody gets angry and nobody storms off after 20 or 30 episodes. All right, that's it. Thanks for joining me. If you like what you see, please hit that subscribe button. And if there's anything I missed that you think I should have covered, hit me up in the comments and we'll try to work that into a future video. Have yourself a great day and we'll see you in the next one.